Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep, completely objective dive into the fascinating world of diplomatic storytelling. We're going to break down the rhetoric of President Trump's White House welcome address to King Charles and Queen Camilla. Regardless of your politics, studying exactly how this speech weaves together the past, the present, and the future, well, it's an absolute masterclass in how you define a modern alliance. So let's just dive right in.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the historic welcome, then we'll trace the alliance's pre-revolution roots. After that, we'll examine a really interesting metaphor about a tree and a legacy, look at some personal ties to Scotland, revisit the World War II special relationship, and finally, we'll look at the historical arc of turning former enemies into cherished friends. Okay, moving to Section 1, the historic White House welcome and its ironic setting. Every great speech acknowledges the room it's being delivered in, right? Well, right off the bat here, the president points out the quote-unquote ironic beginning of honoring a British king right there in the shadows of monuments to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. These are the very men who led a rebellion against the crown. By calling out this irony immediately, the speech totally disarms any of that lingering historical tension. And to smoothly pivot from that irony, the speech uses a very specific milestone: 250 years of American independence. The rhetorical argument they're making here is that celebrating a British king is actually perfectly fitting for this anniversary. Why? Because, as the speech frames it, America's story didn't actually begin in 1776. That brings us to Section 2, pre-revolution roots and shared ancestry. So the speech essentially pushes our perspective way, way back in time. It asserts that long before a constitution was ever written, Americans had a shared culture. It literally draws a direct timeline, starting from a 13th century meadow at Runnymede, where the Magna Carta was signed, straight through to the streets of Philadelphia in 1776, into World War II, and right up to the modern White House welcome. Now, listen closely to the language used to illustrate this connection. It talks about Anglo-Saxon courage and an English faith in standing firm for what is right, good, and true. It's fascinating because the speech frames the American Revolution not as a rejection of British ideals, but actually as an extension of them. By calling it a majestic inheritance, the rhetoric is basically claiming that American patriots were just unleashing this ancient English love of liberty onto a brand new continent. All right, Section 3, a tree and a legacy, visualizing this bond. To really anchor all these abstract historical ideas, the president points to a living symbol just a few dozen feet away on the lawn. The royal tree. Planted years ago by the late Queen Elizabeth II, the speech points out that this tree was laid with British hands, but grew in American soil, and has since tripled in size and tripled in strength. It's just a masterful, super-grounded metaphor for the growth of the US-UK alliance. Continuing with that same metaphor, the speech argues that mighty trees need the absolute strongest roots. And what are those roots? Well, it lists speaking the same language, holding the same values, defending the same extraordinary civilization, and rallying under the twin banners of red, white, and blue. That's the foundation they're laying out to say Americans have no closer friends than the British. Moving on to Section 4, personal ties to Scotland, or the micro-history. Now, to humanize this massive, formal diplomatic event, the speech shifts from macro-history down to the intimate, using the number 63. The president actually injects his own family history here, speaking really warmly of his mother, Mary MacLeod, who was born in Scotland, came to America, and was married to his father for a record 63 years. It's honestly fascinating how a lighthearted anecdote can completely break up heavy geopolitical rhetoric. The president recalls how his Scottish mother would be absolutely glued to the television for royal ceremonies, and he directly quotes her saying, "Charles, look, young Charles, he's so cute. Telling the King of England that your mother had a crush on him, that is an incredibly disarming touch that brings a lot of genuine warmth to a very formal stage." Section 5. The WW2 Special Relationship, Forged in Conflict. The rhetoric then pivots back and anchors the modern special relationship in the defining conflict of the 20th century. It highlights Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt's famous meeting in the North Atlantic to outline a vision for the free world. And what's exceptionally clever here is the specific location. They met on the HMS Prince of Wales. The speech deliberately highlights this because, as you might know, Prince of Wales is the exact title King Charles held longer than anyone in British history. And the speech just compounds that connection. It notes that when Churchill first met the future King Charles, he was totally struck by his intellect, remarking, He is so young to think so much and so well. So the rhetoric essentially has Britain's greatest wartime prime minister vouching for the current king's character and lifelong devotion to duty, right from childhood.
And finally, Section 6, Enemies to Cherished Friends, the Historical Arc.
As the speech nears its conclusion, it uses this brilliant rhetorical juxtaposition. It literally contrasts the soldiers of the Revolutionary War, the Redcoats and Yankees, with the soldiers of World War II, the Tommies and GIs. It really emphasizes that the original wounds of war healed into the absolute most cherished of friendships. They went from enemies to brothers in arms.
And here is the ultimate payoff of the speech's entire setup. Noting that King Charles is soon going to address the U.S. Congress, the president frames it beautifully. The direct descendant of King George III, speaking to the direct successor of the body that gathered in Independence Hall in 1776, it paints this incredible picture, suggesting that if founders like John Adams or George Washington could see this sight today, they'd be moved beyond words.
All of which leaves us with this really profound question to think about. How the centuries-old historical bonds, born from both conflict and shared culture, continue to shape modern global alliances today. Because as we've seen, speeches are rarely just words. They are carefully crafted bridges of time. Keep exploring, keep analyzing, and we'll see you in the next explainer.